Thank you all for joining us. My name is Maha Hilal, and I am the Executive Director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. We're here today to discuss countering violent extremism. The title of our event is The Muslim Threat, Reimagined, Countering Violent Extremism in the War on Terror. We have with us three very esteemed colleagues who will discuss a range of issues that have presented themselves under the guise of a new framework called Countering Violent Extremism. This series, this particular online panel, is part of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms series titled Just Us and Injustice. So we will have with us three speakers. Our last speaker will be joining us shortly, but we have with us now Kalia Abiade, who is the Advocacy Director of the Center for New Community, along with Paula Thompson, who's the coordinator of the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project. I have a bunch of questions that I'd like to ask of all our panelists. And for those of you that are listening to the panel and have any questions, comments, etc., please tweet #UpAgainstCVE. We'll do our best to address any questions or comments that come up, but we really want to make sure that everyone can get in some comments and questions, and we can continue the conversation offline, of course, on the event page and elsewhere. So please do put up your thoughts and comments, etc. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and start the panel. And I want to start with what happened in 2011, which is where this framework of CVE really started to emerge. In 2011, there was a sort of paper/framework released by the White House titled Empowering Local Partners to Prevent Violent Extremism in the United States. After this framework was released and presented, it seemed this idea of countering violent extremism seemed to sort of encapsulate what we had seen previously in the form of post-9/11 counterterrorism policies, but under this new framework incorporated or sought to incorporate a more preventative framework, more of the preemptive policies and tools, etc., that the government could use to capture who they believe to be terrorists in training, or terrorists that just needed a little extra time to commit X act of violence, or whatever it was. So that's kind of the starting point to this framework, and we're going to get into a lot of the details around what it has involved and what strategies have been used, who has it impacted, and then just kind of go from there and see how the conversation develops. So I'm going to start with our first question, which is precisely on the evolution of CVE. So for Kalia and Paula, can you discuss the evolution of the countering violent extremism paradigm from your understanding? And also, can you address how this framework is meant to shift or look differently at counterterrorism policies post 9/11 and pre-CVE framework?
Well, in a recent interview I did with Shannon Irwin of the Muslim Justice League in Boston, she informed me that the CVE actually kind of framework came out in Lisa Monaco's speech after, I mean, the reason that they organized is that speech that she did at, I believe it's Harvard, after the Boston bombing. And I think it was their 1-year anniversary. And she announced that CVE would be going into the communities. And so, however, Shannon Irwin and a group of other female attorneys had been working with the community constantly, and had decided that they were just going to make a coalition because it was so necessary with all the things that had been going on with the FBI and the Muslim community since the Boston bombing. And so they went ahead and formed a coalition to fight back against CVE in the community, and they've been advocating with other groups, other Muslim groups, other mosques, and also other communities of color. And so I think when I interviewed her, that was really the turning point for her, was that announcement that it would be coming into the communities, because I think when MPAC's Safe Spaces was announced, it was pretty vague about where they would be, and in the end, in the Q&A, they weren't releasing any extra information about where it was going to be. So I think everybody was kind of watching. And they tend to use the places that have had incidents previously kind of as a leverage, I suppose. And so that's how I know about that CVE. And the only other thing with the LA, MPAC came out with their safe spaces. And so for me, that was, you know that there are coalitions that have been working with law enforcement and the FBI and even Muslim Task Force. I think they have a Somali task force as well in Minnesota. And so that's the culmination, though, of it coming into being CVE as part of I think it's the Attorney General's involved and law enforcement, and then also health professionals, schools, in a detailed kind of a framework. So that's what I know about those two particular incidents. And David Schenzer called the original New York model the very evasive model, where of course, we found out New York PD were spying on people and following a lot of COINTELPRO, projects. And I think that the focus on Minnesota, Boston, and LA kind of doesn't pay tribute to that first very invasive look that we have. And I know that Shannon also told me that she attended, so George Washington University is one of the universities that's really pushing the agenda. And Lorenzo Vidino, he used to work for Steve Emerson on the Investigative Project on Terrorism, and he's actually deputy director of the program on preventing extremism out there, and he's running a lot of the or overseeing, let's say, with Institute of Strategic Dialogue training that they're doing with schools in the Boston area, with school authority, and what else, law enforcement. And so she went with, I believe, one of the directors of CAIR there to the event, and they were pushing the Prevent agenda from UK. And that was in November of 2015. So, that's what I know on that subject, and maybe my colleague would like to say something. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I think one thing that we try to keep in mind at Center for New Community, and just in general in the Muslim community, is the 2011 was a really important moment in the CV conversation, but by no means the beginning of this kind of community policing tactic, and something that turns the community in on itself to surveil its own members and things like that. So I think it's important to call out that time as a sort of really important moment, but also to contextualize it, and also having this a more like historical lens also would probably help our organizations with some intra-community building. And I just shared a link with Maha that hopefully she can share with the rest of the crew here. But when we think about CVE programs and who they are being targeted toward, and who from within the Muslim community is helping to develop them, I think it's very telling. A lot of Black Muslim communities have called out the fact that they haven't been consulted in these community partnerships, and I think that's really problematic for a number of reasons. One of which is Black Muslim communities are heavily targeted by CVE programs, so it makes sense that in these national dialogues about how they are created, that they'd be consulted, and that we've seen similar missteps in working with various law enforcement agencies, including LAPD and others, where Black Muslim communities are just not thought of in these, when there's a long history of challenges with the community and with the law enforcement. So I think thinking about it this way, and thinking about a longer trajectory of CVE style programming will help us better reach out to different aspects of our community, different members of our community, in developing these and coming at them with a more holistic approach, and thinking about them outside of the context of law enforcement only, but thinking about other ways to address this topic and have these conversations. So I'm not sure if that gets exactly to your question, but I just wanted to call that out at the beginning.
So no, that's great. I think one of the things I wanted to sort of highlight from a preliminary point of view is that we tended to have over the course of the last 14 years different catchphrases, different ways of describing what it is or who it is that is tending to perpetrate acts of violence. So for a long time there was a focus on radicalization and how do we know who's becoming radicalized. And then we have this shift to violent extremism, and then we need to counter violent extremism. And in all of this, there tends to be very little research to substantiate who it is that's going to perpetrate an act of violence, what are their characteristics, and how is the government appropriately responding to research that simply does not exist or research that's not sufficient. So just thinking about the evolution of the terms and thinking about the way that the rhetoric is helping to justify a lot of these policies. So in terms of the target of countering violent extremism policies and programs and practices, there's been this emphasis from the government that we're more or less implementing and designing these in a neutral way. Yes, we know that there are Muslim extremists, but don't worry, we're not actually only targeting the Muslim extremists. And in fact, many of their recent materials, such as the FBI producing of the game online, talks about right-wing extremists and actually neglects to include Muslim extremists as a way of neutralizing, right, the focus or the perceived focus. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, what evidence you can provide to substantiate the critique that these programs do in fact target Muslims and almost exclusively so.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think at the beginning of this month, when President Obama did this speech at the Islamic Society of Baltimore, he called out this unfair targeting of Muslim communities. Right? He said, as Muslim Americans, your entire community so often is targeted or blamed for the violent acts of the very few. No surprise then that the threats and harassments of Muslim Americans have surged. Here at this mosque, twice last year, threats were made against your children. Around the country, women wearing hijab have been targeted. So he calls this out, right? And he continues to do this, and members of the administration continue to do this. Yet, also last week, a military policy paper was unveiled at The Intercept by Murtaza Hussein. He published a piece that showed that there's sort of duality that exists within the administration, right? This is the public relations thing to say, and it's very important that they say that. But in this policy paper, in a piece by Tawfiq Hamid, he writes, in a strategic plan to defeat radical Islam, in this section, that women wearing headscarves are advancing passive terrorism. Right, this is in materials that have been used as a resource for law enforcement and for the military, and that was originally published in 2011. And because the Air Force thought it'd be so useful, they republished it in the middle of last year. So I think time and time again we see these references in the training materials and in internal documents that identify things that are associated with being Muslim as being on the path to radicalization. So things like increased attendance at a mosque or the change in the way you dress. These are all things that are identified, things that are specifically tied to Muslim identity or Muslim practice that we see repeatedly in training materials. So I think that's one place where we start to make that connection.
Paula, did you want to respond before I introduce Jaylani? Can you unmute your microphone?
Yes. In my research, I approach these projects as civilizing projects. And one of the things that is commonly done is that the people, and I use Stephen Harrell, he refers to them as periphery people in the colonial stages, but so they're told what they need to do. And I find in several speeches of Obama's, we can see that he's telling the Muslim community they need to condemn, they need to stand up against terrorism. And also he started now saying they need to promote our ideals, right, our ideals of democracy. And so I feel like this piggybacks very well off what that my previous colleague said, that we can see that no other faith community is being called upon, in comparison, to do these things.
Okay, great. So we just actually had Mr. Jaylani Hussein join us. He is the Executive Director of CAIR Minnesota. So thank you, Jaylani, for joining us. I want to give you a chance to respond to the first two questions that I've asked. So the first question is about the evolution of this countering violent extremism paradigm, and also what is sort of the difference? What is CVE meant to address that policies preceding CVE weren't doing? And second, can you provide some sort of evidence that these policies are in fact disproportionately targeting Muslims, simply because the government denies it and also attempts to go the extra mile by often using neutralizing language and focusing on, for example, right-wing extremism?
I got to unmute, I guess. Thank you for having me, and I apologize for running a little late. My other meeting took a little long. And thank you for hosting such an important conversation. I think this past year and a half working on this issue here in Minnesota, we learned a lot about the fear that exists in most communities when law enforcement or departments of law enforcement bring up this idea, we want to help you, but in the same time you see the same law enforcement organizations really step up their general surveillance, and the cases that you hear about are cases that have high informant, or informants are the main center of these types of cases. So just to kind of answer the first two questions, CVE, or this idea of violent extremism, has kind of existed for a long period of time, probably for post-September 11th. But I think we start to notice a little bit more after the 7/7 bombing in the UK, where much of this type of conversation started to happen in the UK, and they started a program called Prevent in the UK, and that kind of led with more of a global effort to address some of this issue. And instead of looking at this problem from both the legal aspects of it, the civil rights aspect of it, and also the law enforcement aspect of it, law enforcement decided to say it's not a law enforcement issue, it's a community issue. And the community need to become law enforcement in a general sense. So it transformed from being, something where law enforcement agencies are responsible for, protecting all of us, and they're responsible for doing this really hard work of identifying and working with the community, but also taking on this on their own, and they start blaming the community, saying the community is the one not at the table, and so therefore we have to do these robust efforts of working with the community and finding out who's with us and who's against us, and it kind of fed with the great deal of ignorance about Islam and Muslims in the world in general, but also here in the United States. So Muslim communities on the opposite side have always been at the table with the FBI, with law enforcement, educating them, talking to them. And we learned from across the United States that these engagements where the community was fully involved, the FBI used those information and those meetings for surveillance, which was really a surprise for many of the communities across the United States. And that continues to build the distrust between the community and law enforcement agencies. And now you add a program that says we're going to address violent extremism, but we're only going to address the Muslim version of violent extremism. And that narrative, which is highly polarizing and highly sensationalized in the media, has now become almost a major a talking point, as we see in today's political rhetoric. So the transformation went from being a law enforcement project, something that law enforcement do on a daily basis, gather intelligence, execute that, use that, and to then taking that ownership and now shifting the blame and saying the community is not doing enough. The community leaders are not law enforcement. They're not going to go around and ask people, by the way, what are you doing? What is this and what is that? And in reality, actually, during the Mueller days of the FBI, he acknowledged that it was actually the community that came forward and stepped forward without even being asked to do that. And so today we have a very difficult and a challenging program that has created really a barrier, I think, to this type of relationship. So since I'm from Minnesota and I'm kind of talking, Minnesota has kind of been a center for this discussion nationally because of young men leaving to Somalia for Al-Shabaab, and now we have a group of kids who are facing charges. Some of them have pled guilty to joining ISIS. And so again, we're learning every day from these cases that there's a lot of questions that should be asked. There was a recent local Fox News did a report on an FBI informant who said that the FBI is leaving out the bigwigs, and they keep just arresting these young kids who were literally somewhat entrapped or not. But so again, that when community hear that, it just fuels the distrust and creates it even much more difficult. So I'm kind of coming around to answering both questions, but I think in Minnesota, we had a meeting with the U.S. Attorney in Minnesota, who's leading this effort, Andrew Luker, and we brought civil rights organizations. We had the ACLU, NAACP, we had a National Lawyers Guild, we had CAIR, we had the Somali Bar Association, we had really a number of activists who met with the U.S. Attorney's office and just to know what's going on. And his response to those in the room who are not Muslim was, "This is not for you. This is not about you. And your kids are not joining ISIS. And this program is only for the Muslims, and not even the Muslims. It's only for the Somalis in Minnesota." And so this idea of a U.S. attorney who's in charge of prosecuting, the crime, wherever it comes from, to say that we're only addressing this issue for the Somali community, the Muslim community, tells you that we have a real concern, and it does show that there's a disproportionate focus on the Muslim community. Interesting enough, Minnesota, we have actually an individual who had been charged for violent extremism, and they're not actually Somali. There's a young man who was trying to, I think, blow up his school, and there's another gentleman who was caught for making bombs. And so, even in Minnesota, we still have cases here where there is individuals who are trying to do violent criminal act, and come from that extremist background. So it is disproportionate, and unfortunately today in Minnesota, the Minnesota Muslim community, the number one story that is talked about is this issue of violent extremism, and it has created a great deal of stigma that today the number one bullying factor in all of the schools that I deal with and all the cases that I'm hearing from is kids being called terrorists in Minnesota. And so I have right now, there's a little trend. We haven't publicized a lot of this because we're afraid of copycatting, and kids will be kids. So we've seen a trend where kids will take a picture of a Muslim girl in school, and then on WhatsApp, have a little comments there saying, terrorism watch, or here's a terrorist, here's another one. And there was actually one that was publicized in St. Cloud where he said disabled ISIS, I think disabled ISIS soldier. And there was a Somali girl who was in a wheelchair, from some sort of leg injury. So again, it's this idea that there is a clear disproportion, and now CVE proposes itself for the layman people that, it's the community needs to be the ones. They're the ones hiding these individuals, and law enforcement are just trying their best, and they really got nothing. That's what most people read out of this. I know CVE is a very complex and there's many issues involved in it. But really, for the person who's layman out there, is like, well, why don't they accept these programs? Why are they denying the law enforcement from doing their job when in fact the law enforcement have been allowed to do their job? I'll stop there.
Can I add to that? So I think what Brother Jaylani was saying about, especially the girls being targeted, I think is a really important component of this, because a lot of times when we talk about CVE programs, they're targeted toward young men. They're really identified as potential radicals or potential extremists, but a lot of the identifiers, as in that passive terrorism article from last week, Muslim women, Muslim young girls are easily identifiable as Muslims and targets for bullies or hate violence. And so I think that at the same time the government is doing this sort of double speak where, yes, we see that Muslims are most targeted, yet here are the things you should look for, and they describe a Muslim woman. It's not hard to see where the government is reinforcing some of the potential for hate violence against Muslims, and particularly Muslim women, and also just feeding into this loop where it's not clear whether it's coming from the government or coming from society, but there's definitely a loop of targeted language and violence that takes place against not only the boys that are targeted in these programs, but the girls and young women as well.
Paula, did you want to add anything before I comment? Okay. So, I think this is very interesting. I think we're all in agreement that, of course, these programs, the CVE programs, are distinctly targeting Muslims. Now, the question is, does a moral claim regarding the practice of focusing on Muslims hold any weight? Does the government really care? Because essentially we're using a moral appeal, that it's not okay to target Muslims because that means they're not equal citizens under the law. That means they're not guaranteed equal constitutional rights. So when we think about towards the end in terms of strategies, what are the strategies that are actually going to work? We're consistently in a place where we're saying, yes, Muslims may have committed some acts of terrorism or violent extremism or whatever it is, but at the same time, there's X number of right-wing extremists that have perpetrated more acts of violence. And people know that. It's not a secret. But nonetheless, they continue to focus on Muslims. So thinking about the ways in which we frame the issue and how the issue is being framed and what are the strategies that follow from that. So I want to ask another question. I want to skip over one of the questions because I think what you all were previously talking about goes into the degree to which the Muslim community should be embracing it or not, should be embracing the CVE framework, the degree to which the onus is placed on the Muslim community, and how it's framed. And something I'm interested in particular is the framing of CVE in empowerment terms. So in other words, it's for your own empowerment, the government would suggest, for you to take on the issue of CVE within your community. We're just helping you deal with an internal problem within your community, and it's only you that can solve this problem. So not only are they framing it in empowerment terms, but it's also framed in public health terms, as if it's this disease that's within the community, and only those within the community can help stop the spread of this disease. So I want you all to comment on that.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think, again, this is part of these language issues that we keep bringing up, but I want to refer to research and commentary by Sahar Aziz, for one, who points out that, if we really want to talk about empowering our communities, law enforcement might not be the best way to go, especially when we're talking about these activities that fall within this pre-criminal space where no one has committed a crime. It's just ideas and behaviors that have been deemed on the path toward radicalization, but they are not criminal acts. So in that case, if somebody is actually in trouble, if there's a young person who does need some type of intervention, I think we need to question whether law enforcement is the correct way to go, especially when you have families and communities who already have such distrust of law enforcement? You know, might there be some social service angles to approach if, you know, your young person is having some type of crisis or problem of any kind, whether it's CVE or we see the same issue in gang prevention programs, our gang intervention programs, drug prevention programs, right? We tend to criminalize things that are not crimes. So I think CVE is no different than a lot of issues that we have in society where we're criminalizing the things leading up to the actual crime and not actually looking at the root causes.
So I have a problem as an activist out of UC Berkeley with empowerment being tied to problematization, especially the way that there's suggestions that our empowerment is tied to state power and state projects. But I also wanted to look at the problematization of the Muslim community as a bigger issue, you know, with the Japanese internment, for example. And the way that this group was targeted in the past during World War II and interned. And also, since you mentioned, you know, health issues and this issue being seen as a problematization within the Muslim community, you know, Chinese exclusion also included issues around yellow peril and, you know, public health threats as well. And so if we look at this again as a larger trajectory of the past, we can see that, you know, it's not exclusively, you know, a Muslim or a new thing, although right now CVE is exclusively targeting Muslims. There's a larger history behind these kinds of projects. So that's just what I wanted to bring in.
I'll just add, I think both of you covered kind of the general idea. I would say, in at least from what we have in Minnesota. In Minnesota, we have this idea that you know, we have about almost $1 million that was funded into a pool of money from foundation, majority coming from foundations, to do social work. So CVE being viewed here is a little bit different than maybe in Boston and Los Angeles, where it's about these policies and ideas, but here it's about social service package. So, and the way the empowerment here is, we're going to uplift your community through CVE. That because your community is a community of suspects and all of your youth are potential terrorists, that we're going to provide you, here's some money to help you with after-school programs. Here's some money to provide mentorships, because we believe that if we do these things, we will help stop radicalization. And so this idea of empowerment is through social work and social services. But the reality is, in the community, majority of the people see it as a major conflict of interest. You know, for the fact of the matter, you know, you can't prosecute and also provide a social service. And in Minnesota, we have history of that, where that completely failed, and the community were told, here's some money to do some police work and police and community relations, and then on top of that, they were going to do these after-school programs and actually have a basketball league. But part of the directives from the FBI was to do to have a list, and when the organizations that signed up were informed of this after the program actually ended, they were like, you know, we didn't know about it, but we did have the FBI asking us for lists of attendees, and so right now the community, and we've shared that with some of the things that the community came together in kind of responding to the CVE, mentioning that, you know, if you do this line where you cross and say social services are your really biggest need, and that is what we're going to help you with, and we're going to empower you with this. Well, the community, just like in the UK, will start, you know, having divisions among themselves, and on top of that, people will see that you are repeating government messaging, and if you take this money, you could be, you know, spying on our family, spying on our community. And I actually draw back to what happened in Minnesota in 2007, 2008, when those young men were leaving to join this war in Somalia, and to join this terrorist organization Al-Shabaab. You know, there was a great deal of crackdown and over surveillance of the mosque, and actually led to many parents taking their children out of Sunday schools and they just took them out from that Sunday school in the mosque, and they went to a Sunday school that was not inside of a mosque. But the reality is the community actually lost a little bit of their ability to express themselves. I know we kind of jumped over that question a little bit, but it created this problem where the community lost trust in the institutions because of the fact that these institutions were just coming under suspicious. There was nothing direct links or anything, and later on even the FBI had to say, no, mosques are involved, we found nothing of that. But still, the initial suspicion was enough for an entire community to kind of draw themselves out. And so today we had honest conversations with these foundations, and I'm telling them, I said, you're a foundation, you know how to work with the community. You've done that for a long time. You understand what these programs will mean for our community. There's no reason for you to link it to a program that is stigmatizing. And on top of that, there's no proven, from all of the science out there of studying all of this, there's no proven record that a mentorship will stop a kid from joining a terrorist organization or an after-school program. But at the same time, I'm put in a difficult position to say, in our community, we have such a great deal of disparities. I mean, we have the Minnesota Somali community today. They are 75% in the poverty line, so below the poverty line. Education disparities, health disparities, all kinds of disparities. And so any funds that come to support the community could help. Why does it have to be part of a CVE program? If you're doing a good social service program, why does it have to be linked, knowing that that type of law enforcement link could create problems for the community and even for the people who are working at these nonprofits? So this type of, now in Minnesota at least, the empowerment has been more focused on this idea that we're going to help you. So what if you sign up and you help you? And I believe that that majority of the community has rejected. Over 90% of the mosques and the Twin Cities in Minnesota have completely rejected it. The largest Somali American national organization that has over 30 centers across the United States has come out publicly to reject the way the CVE has stand. And so the only people in the Minnesota who are even in the room are there because they see potential money and resources for their community, and they're hardened to be balancing that. But in reality, the empowerment is much more about this idea of providing resources.
So that's actually really interesting when we think about empowerment, because empowerment, as it's defined, necessarily implies that the community itself is the one doing the defining of what problems exist within it. So then if you attempt, as the government is doing, to establish a partnership where there's unequal power, it's simply impossible. The community cannot be empowered if the leverage point is money, and consequently where the relationship between the government and the community is going to be exactly the same. So I think that that's a really important analysis, looking at the aspect of power and to what extent do these CVE programs under the guise of empowerment really seek to readjust and shift the power differential between the government and community. So going back to the question we sort of glossed over in terms of what you guys see as specific rights issues that have been violated in the course of CVE programming. I think when we look at many of the ways that Muslims have been targeted, we tend to think more along the lines of who has been directly targeted. But I would argue, for example, that if a community becomes aware that there's an informant and they stop going to the mosque, that is a violation of their freedom of religious rights. It's not that they've been targeted, they may never be targeted, but the fact that they are changing their behavior out of the fear of the government will be targeting them, that to me is a violation of that right. So if you could speak to some of those issues.
Nobody wants to be first. So I mean, I think we can also call out the explicit rights and targeting that is happening, because I definitely agree that there is this sort of secondary impact. But to think about the first ones, if we're thinking, we mentioned a little bit earlier these stages of radicalization. We didn't identify them, so I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about that. But when the FBI is talking about this path to radicalization, they're talking about this pre-radicalization stage, which could include converting to Islam or attending a mosque or being involved in a Muslim community at your university, workplace, online, in a prison, etc. Right? Then identity, when someone starts identifying in a new way, identifying themselves in a new way, isolating themselves from a former life, taking on new clothing, growing a beard, traveling, then there's indoctrination and then action. And again, a lot of this, the pre-criminal things obviously are before action. So this pre-radicalization, identity formation, and indoctrination are really what they're looking at. And in that case, I mean, there's obviously a chilling effect on attending a mosque, feeling comfortable praying in public, and just anecdotally, I know of a lot of women who have stopped covering their hair out of fear of being identified on the street or being harassed in the airport or in their school or workplace. And I mean, that may seem like a small deal, but that's a pretty big deal for somebody who is deciding that that's what they want to do, and for fear of not only the government intrusion, but what might happen to them on the street. And then, when we're talking about children and being bullied, there are children who don't want to identify as Muslim or changing their names or going by nicknames in their schools. And so I shudder to think of what will happen to those kids as they become older, and they're out of the school environment but are becoming young adults, and how they will feel free to identify or practice their religion completely.
I wanted to add that I think that out of the NYPD report, I think it's Mapping Muslims with CUNY, I think that was very demonstrative of the disruption of speech and your speech acts, right? The fact that they went through even MSA letters and announcements, and also targeted their Muslim speech. And that was an indicator of possible radicalization. I mean, even a trip, right? A whitewater rafting trip was a possible radicalization, act. And I think also, there was plenty of talk about the way people dressed being targeted, again, as Kalia said, passive terrorism. And I think the final thing I wanted to say about that is it disrupts the freedom of worship. And I think Brother Jaylani touched on that when he said that, mosques were disrupted and institutions weren't trusted anymore. And I think that this document, which is firsthand account from people directly affected by NYPD programs that we're very fortunate to have, because oftentimes we don't hear of community impact. I think there haven't been community impact studies done before this occurred. And we can see how even imams aren't able to counsel their flock, and how it disrupts people from going to the mosque because they will be surveilled. They have seen their surveillance vehicles outside. Many mosques I know have found informants. I know that there has been listening equipment as well. And so, again, it leads to something like you mentioned, Maha, about this sort of virtual internment, right, that Dr. Bazian talks about or has written about, that goes back to it's not the physical internment that, the Japanese encountered, but it is a virtual internment where we start to self-discipline. We start the panopticon in our own communities. We watch our own behavior, and we change. I was with my professor. He's the director of the Center of Islamic Studies at a graduate theological union, and we were in the street talking about my paper, and it mentions ISIS, and he lowers his voice when he says it, and then it was ISIS, and there's apartments right there, and we shouldn't have to lower our voice in an academic area just because we say ISIS, but this is a symbol of little ways we self-discipline, we micromanage our life because of countering violent extremism, that we can't even talk, not even politically, but we see in the Mapping Muslims document, that they were all over the city documenting, what people watched on TV, what was going on in a restaurant, down to the food they ate. Like, you can't even eat food, So I think that's a very important thing that, we focus on, the way it just disrupts life, like your right to have a life, a life that's free, our sense of true freedom. Sorry, I got impassioned there.
Great. So I want to move on to the next question. So we know that there's been pilot programs, right, started in Boston, Minneapolis, and Los Angeles, and it's great that we have Jaylani with us. We know the official government narrative as to why these cities were selected, but can you comment a little bit on that and how, to the extent to which you know they've impacted each of these communities?
I'll start. Yeah. So, obviously, Minnesota, for having young people leave and then being played out in the national news, and you could probably even tell when the 6 kids were recently arrested when that happened. The press management of that case let you know that this was something that I mean, everybody came. I mean, the entire world press was at Minneapolis when these 6 kids were arrested. So this idea that this major grandstanding on these cases, and if you actually look at the actual cases, they weren't really the kind of kids that were, that they all had their own tickets, and it was the informant actually who was, from the stories that we have learned not only from the parents but even just the documents, it looked like the informant was actually the one coaching and doing a lot of the pushing in a sense. But in Minnesota, obviously, that the previous cases kind of led to just at least some understanding. Boston, obviously, the Boston bombing, I don't know really what to go beyond that. And then LA, I really have no idea really of why, and maybe because I really don't speculate too much on why LA. But going back now, I think the immediate impact in the community was, it was first of all announced in September 11 of 2014. How ironically you choose a day like that to announce such a program. And then, when the initial idea came up, then there was this planned summit, and civil rights organizations got together, wrote a letter, 27 of them, and then immediately that conference in the White House was also just scrapped for now. And then a week later, after the Charlie Hebdo, killings, it was put right back up on the map that it's going to happen. It was almost a week later. Here's what we're doing now to address this issue. In Minnesota, the immediate impact was that the U.S. Attorney's Office said, I met with everybody. I have everybody's input. Here's what we're going to do. And I asked a lot of people, and I said, when did you guys actually sat down and provided input? And most people said he came and talked about what he does and what his office is, but nobody ever heard of an actual, we're going to do a CVE program. We are looking for community input. What is your input? However, when he talks, he expresses the idea that he met with everybody and he got input, and this is an issue. And he utters, he says stuff like, social services are needed. Well, yeah, I mean, if you go to any community meeting, people are going to say, look, we have disparities, we have all these issues, our kids don't have any jobs, we need money, we need resources in our communities. So I think I would encourage for people who are watching today, go to CAIR Minnesota's website. We have an entire page of CVE information that you can get. Go to, I think LA has a document, CAIR National has some information. The CVE, the Brennan Center for Justice in New York has whole documents, and actually they've done some fantastic research and have exposed in previous programs before these programs were even launched that not only blurred the lines but really had directives of surveilling the community as an outreach social service program. So I think right now where we're at and where we were about maybe a year ago in Minnesota is completely different. In the beginning, it was the civil rights organization really raising the awareness. We got a lot of conversations with our local leadership and religious groups and centers, and we pushed back. But unfortunately, one of the most interesting things about this program is we had a letter that was signed by 50 organizations in Minnesota, which represents almost 90% of all of the centers, completely dismissed by the U.S. Attorney's Office, completely dismissed. He would, just acted like nothing happened. And then one of the things that followed it, the entire media, national and local, made it seem like some people are rejected. Some. I mean, 50 organizations became some. And actually, I talked to, and I won't mention which paper, but I talked to some people in some of the journals who said, we can't push back that hard. So because it's coming from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and obviously we don't want to rub too much against that office because we will lose media availabilities. So even our voice, when you have 50 organizations that represent the majority of organizations in the Twin Cities, saying, listen, this is not how you should work with our community. Even in our statement, it wasn't, we reject the program and good luck. No, it was like, here's what's the problem with it. Here's what you need to do to fix it. And one of the most core things that came out of this entire conversation in Minnesota was, for the first time, we actually had organizations come together. We had all these 50 organizations actually, by coming together, they actually started a program. They started a committee to talk about this and talk about what are we already doing and how can we improve on the efforts. And for the first time, I had this meeting with 20 different representations of mosques, and they said, listen, this is what we're already doing. We know this is something that we need to do something about, and here's what we're doing. From curriculum additions to training their teachers, to leaders talking about it, to parents being involved, to adding security on the weekend in some of these large centers so that they know who's coming in and out, not just for the kids, but also people who might be, informants or other forms doing crazy things in our mosques and stuff. So, and everybody kind of sat in the tables like, oh, I could do that in my mosque too. I could do that in my community center. I could help address with this. But also in these conversations, we heard some really frank issues, which was, for example, the story of an imam who was asked, one of the parents of the kids who was recently arrested was asked to go and join or go visit this kid because, only clergy and I think very close families are allowed in certain circumstances. And this clergy said, no, I'm not going. And the reason why he said is because the day I walk into that prison will be the first and last day that I'll ever be free from the FBI. They will monitor me for the rest of my life. And so even the clergy, this has created really a fear. And I'll end with this. Since this issue has come up, and this is the thing I even told Lugar, and by the way, I've asked, I would talk to him, and I had some conversations with him, and I said, I'm being honest with you, there's ways to get what you really need to get to, but without calling us all suspects, driving this force. And he himself even agreed with me. He said, this is not my program. This is the Department of Homeland Security. I said, okay, let's work together and make that happen. But obviously, nothing came out of that. But the point I want to get to, and I think a good place to end is, when this came out into the public and the community were heard about, I started getting calls from centers, from people who were asking me about a CPR class, if that was CVE. The community readiness plan. So people just completely were shocked. I don't want to do anything with this. I don't want nothing to do with that. And one of the interesting things is that there's a lot of youth organizations that are now lining up for this money and think that they could do something about it. And I even shared this with Ruger and others. I said, listen, there's organizations in our community that can impact 6,000 kids on an average week. They will never want to do anything with you. And the reason why is because they don't want to lose the confidence of their parents. They don't want to lose the confidence of the people who trusted their kids. But these organizations can have a bigger impact in any effort to empower the kids and work with the kids. So this fear and this this program has literally created major problems. Law enforcement agencies who have had strong relationships, police, local police who have had strong relationships with the community, had to come to Friday prayers and say, we're not part of CVE. We're not CVE. We are your local police department, because they knew immediately that their involvement could potentially risk that relationship that they've worked hard to do. And today, right now, and just to report back to you, last few weeks ago, there was a whole youth movement, because I think that's where really we need to engage. And so there's a Cedar Riverside youth that have stepped up, and they have a video out there. They started a campaign. They had their first event, and they just were talking to the people who were actually supporting CV, and they're like, why are you there? And I remember there was this actually back and forth conversation where a gentleman said, we want to be at these tables, because if we're not at these tables, somebody else will be there. It's like, no, the whole entire community left that table. You don't need to be at that table, So I think now in Minnesota, there's a little bit of more maturity, and I'm hearing there will be planned protests and many other things coming, which we're no longer even involved, and that's a good sign that the community is also taking a little bit of an ownership.
I want to ask one more question before we end, based on Jaylani, what you were talking about, and to give Kalia and Paula a chance to respond. Just in terms of the range of strategies that are being utilized, in particular by Muslim organizations to push back or not against these CVE frameworks. Many of the organizations do make this argument that, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. But the initiatives and programs that have continued to evolve seem to indicate that no matter where Muslims are, nothing will substantially change. So I'm wondering if you can talk about challenges to CVE programming that you've seen, what has been successful, and where there is a distinction or where there's opposition in the strategies, what that means for the larger push against CVE.
Yeah, I think it's really encouraging to hear the stories again coming out of Minnesota in terms of the ability to push back, because I think there is a resignation among a lot of our communities still, especially the ones that aren't pilot cities, but what can we do about that? There's nothing that we can do. This is a real concern that we have, and what else are we supposed to do? So I think the work that's happening in Minnesota is really inspiring, in terms of seeing it starting. We're a few steps behind you here in Chicago, so it's good to see the community mobilization that's happened there. And I think one way at our organization that we are pushing back with, this has its limited uses, but it's still useful nonetheless, I think, is just continue to call out some of the language that we're seeing in these training materials, and to really identify that duplicity that's happening and really try to get more attention on that problematic framework. And I think Jaylani mentioned Brennan Center, and both Brennan Center and ACLU filed lawsuits earlier this year to just do that, get more information about these programs, because there's still so much that we don't know. And I think, when we're trying to challenge the framework, and there's still all of these layers and layers of information that we should have as a public, and we don't, that signals a lot of trouble. So I think, one, we can push for more information, and two, push back on what we do know about them, and then three, those coalitions are super important at the national level, but also in the local level.
So I sort of see a revamping of CVE kind of going into a new phase. So a new Center for Global Engagement was opened by the State Department, and I understand that Panetta will be heading that, and I know that a few imams are involved. Well, Panetta and Tony Blair. Okay, so and one of the major pushers of the CVE in our communities as well is Institute for Strategic Dialogue. I told you that I spoke with Shannon Irwin for Muslim Justice League about Boston, and it seems like although that there is some presence of CVE push still in the communities, and there is some division between what should be done, she was unaware of any funding given, like Brother Jaylani said, happened in his community so far. That's one of the things I was investigating. And it seems like most of the training, as I spoke to you about, has been focused on health professionals and the education sector. So I feel like if they can't penetrate the Muslim community, or there's kind of a stall there, they're going another direction, especially, Institute for Strategic Dialogue and George Washington University. And I know USC has, at their School of Price, they've been taking in people for countering violent extremism. I haven't seen Eventbrites yet of these kind of meetings, but I'm very suspect about that. Another concern is the Institute for Strategic Dialogue has strong cities, and so they're having cities join individually for kind of a global CVE police, right? It's a big international policing thing. I think Boston didn't join, but I'm not sure. Atlanta, New York, and a few others, and it's funded by the State Department for the first year, and then it's supposed to be funded by foundations afterwards. And so that's a concern. Also, as I was telling you, so safe spaces, because I'm originally from LA, kind of died in the water, more or less, right? Where it's our own backyard, and it didn't really take off. And even the mosques that were kind of entertaining it supposedly have new boards and new anti-CVE sheikhs. But one of the things I noticed is that in the ISNA debate, Salam Mariyati said, well, maybe it needs to be revamped, maybe something needs to be done. And we see that they've kind of gone and made a new Safe Spaces, right? A Safe Spaces Part 2. And if you follow Alejandro Butel, who wrote the first Safe Spaces, you know, he, on something that has taken our criticism and our pushback and created something called No Hate. So it's trying to like whitewash CVE, right? Let's get the Muslim focus out. And it reminds me of this latent Orientalism that Edward Said spoke about. You get to a point where you don't even have to say Muslims anymore. It just pops in your head, terrorist Muslim, okay? This, you know, oh, Muslim. It's just, you don't even have to, like, they've even whitewashed, like, the UASI, right? The urban shields that they do. First, they were using people to dress up as Muslim terrorists, go blow things up. Now you can do it just with a school shooter, and you know that the Muslim image is there. It's just in your head. You can't escape it. I mean, we have Sharia now in our language. You know, we have jihad now in our language. It's just, it's so penetrated that you just don't have to be direct anymore. And I, you know, see Seamus Hughes from GWU, he went to a mosque, right? And he's showing in the background at a mosque, right? The right-wing extremism, like he's being fair to us. Oh, thank you, you know, for covering right-wing extremism. We don't want the projects at all for anybody. It's not okay just to say, well, if you bring the white people in, then we'll accept it. You know, it's ridiculous. We don't want any invasive, you know, civilizing projects or disciplinary projects whatsoever. It's just, it's beyond. So I kind of see the shift. Yes, okay, they're working on the periphery. If they can't get the larger groups, and you know, thank God in Minnesota they can't, and there has been some pushback, and they acknowledge that. And I wanted to tell Brother Jaylani that, you know, I know he's been heard because I actually read about his meeting on Monday at the, I think it's the Boyle Center. John Horgan tweeted that, okay, and he's one of the big counterterrorism experts, and he tweeted that Muslim communities are pushing back. So Start Center is acknowledging the pushback and saying, what can we do now? So they're taking the information that they're getting from our community and saying, what next? Okay, we heard your communities. How can we whitewash this? How can we fix it? What can we call it? We can change it from countering violent extremism to building resilience, you know? And so there's all these efforts. Almost, I was telling Maha, they're changing it from even considering changing it at Start under Alejandro Butel to like countering, it's kind of like targeted violence, right? Instead of countering violent extremism. So almost as they think, as we get a grasp on it and we start to manufacture papers like they're going to outsmart people, I don't know. But, you know, these are just my findings in the way forward. It's so they'll take a big group if they can have it. They'll take small groups, but they'll also take individuals. And they've made that very clear that they're willing to work with individuals. So I think it's not gone from the community, even though some places it might seem stalled or quiet.
Microphone.
Thank you. So I just want to ask if anyone has any final remarks. This has been a truly fascinating panel, and I'm thrilled to have had these your very like divergent and interesting perspectives on CVE programming and the way it's been manifested in the Muslim community. So before we go, I see Kalia just dropped off. Do either of you want to make any final comments? Any last thoughts? Where should we go from here?
I'll just start. Thanks again, Paula, for getting some of those things. You know, Minneapolis is also one of those Strong Cities initiative, and one of the most interesting things in Minneapolis is that the mayor of Minneapolis was one of the people who launched the program in the UN, and there's not a single bleep about that program in Minneapolis. Her and I think Balaji were the only two speakers about this program when it was launched. I just want to say that, you know, from just what we've learned, you know, in Minnesota now we are also expanding the base for anti-CVE coalition and really bringing the larger group of audience and anti-war and social justice organizations to be aware of what's happening. You know, we have, as I said, in Minnesota, the shift has been to this money, you know, social service, and even we have a bill that's proposing for $2 million to stop radicalization and terrorism. But here's just, you know, so I think the work is really to continue engaging and enlighten people. And I think one thing that for some of us who are much more involved in CVE, we get caught up in the complexities of all of the intricacies, but how do we simplify a little bit of this message so that a larger audience can understand? So in Minnesota, we actually, and you could go today and go to C-SPAN TV, and you could actually find that a statement from the Minneapolis Public School, what their CVE program would look like. From what we understand right now, it's actually not happening, but what they would do is to monitor Somali kids during lunch hour and after school programs to see for signs of radicalization. They would hire people who, that's all their job is. That's it. They just go and watch kids and what they do, their behavior at lunch and after school, and watch for kids' religiosity. And as we learned this week, and I know most people just commented, I guess hijab is a passive form of terrorism, and so that's where you start. All the girls are wearing hijab, then they're A, and then what happens? You know, they pray, that's B, and then they still get checked off. And then one of the scary things, and I know we didn't get into the puppet website, you know, one of the interesting things about that, if we don't talk about the content and all the issues with it, let's just talk about the teacher and the student. The student is teachers, social workers. Who's the teacher? The FBI. And what happens in these kind of situations is, what is the student going to do when they have to report something? They're not going to report to the local police or their superintendent or the principal. They're going to report to the FBI. And so with currently what's happening across the United States, the anti-Muslim rhetoric, just imagine a teacher who's got an axe to grind, who says, I got 17 kids who could potentially be a terrorist in my school or in my because all of them are frustrated with this or frustrated with that. Or he wrote in his essay that, you know, he enjoys going back to Somalia, and that's, you know, what does that mean? That might be a code word for you know, he's going to do something crazy. So with that, again, I thank you for having me, and I encourage us maybe to continue this dialogue and to operate that. But I really urge our, you know, the people who are working really hard in CV to let's dumb it down for a larger for a larger audience to understand. And I think many parents would not want their kids to be surveillance at school, and that's what it's going to be leading toward. So thank you very much.
So thank you all again so much. Really, it was just an amazing conversation. I've already gotten feedback about how great this conversation has been. Since we did not get a chance to talk about the FBI's new program, the online program targeting children, if you have any resources that would be helpful for our viewers and those who may watch the video afterwards, I would kindly ask that you post some resources on the Facebook event page, and we can also post it on the YouTube page where this panel will be posted later today. So thank you all again so much. I'm really looking forward to continuing the work with you, and hopefully we can continue to have broader and deeper conversations about CVE and the problematic aspects within the Muslim community. So thank you again, and I will talk with you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.